The courtroom falls silent. You could hear a pin drop. That's how tense the courtroom became when Judge Edith Jones slowly removed her glasses and stared across the room. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. The murmurs stopped. Even the air seemed to freeze. In the witness area stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, known for her fiery speeches and bold attitude. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even when standing before a federal judge. But that day, something about her confidence was being tested. The case itself wasn't the headline. It was the moment that would soon spread across social media like wildfire. Cameras were rolling, journalists were whispering, and the public benches were packed with spectators eager to witness history in the making. Judge Jones cleared her throat and spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Miss Crockett," she said, "this courtroom values respect, not just for the law, but for the people who serve it. I've noticed your attitude stands out, perhaps too much." The words hit like a sudden storm. The entire courtroom gasped, not because of what was said, but because of who it was said to. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressed together. She didn't back down. You could almost see the fire burning behind her composure. Still, she kept her voice steady. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've always believed that standing firm for truth isn't attitude, it's integrity." A few heads in the gallery nodded in silent agreement. Even some jurors exchanged uncertain looks. Judge Jones leaned forward, intrigued. There was something powerful about Jasmine's tone. It wasn't defiance, it was courage. For a moment, the judge simply studied her. Then, with a faint smile, she replied, "Integrity is admirable, Ms. Crockett, but in this room, even integrity must wear patience." The tension broke, not with laughter, but with awe. The conversation had turned from confrontation to something deeper, a clash of principle and discipline. What no one knew yet was that this exchange was only the beginning of a chain reaction that would leave everyone, including the judge herself, shocked before the day was over. The unexpected calm before the storm. The moment Judge Jones finished speaking, the courtroom held its breath once more. Everyone expected Jasmine Crockett to argue back. That was her reputation. She was known for standing tall against pressure, for never letting anyone, no matter how powerful, silence her voice. But this time, she didn't respond immediately. Instead, Jasmine took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone in front of her, and smiled. Not arrogantly, but calmly, almost as if she was trying to understand the lesson behind the judge's words. Her calmness surprised everyone, even the judge. "Your Honor," Jasmine began softly, "you're right. Patience is a strength I'm still learning. But I also believe passion is not disrespect. When people care deeply about justice, it sometimes sounds louder than tradition." The courtroom murmured. A few people even nodded in agreement. The clerk at the side glanced nervously at the judge, unsure if this would count as defiance or wisdom. Judge Jones tilted her head slightly. She wasn't angry. She was curious. For decades, she had faced lawyers, defendants, and witnesses who argued, shouted, and begged. But Jasmine's tone, respectful yet unshaken, was different. "Ms. Crockett," the judge replied, "you remind me of myself when I was your age. Strong opinions, strong words. But the system doesn't always reward strength. It rewards restraint." Jasmine smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the problem, Your Honor. Maybe the system needs both, restraint and strength working together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience again. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. They knew something powerful was happening. This wasn't just an exchange of words. It was a generational clash between authority and modern conviction. Judge Jones leaned back in her chair, thinking deeply. For the first time that day, she didn't just see Jasmine as a fiery congresswoman. She saw her as a reflection of change, of a world moving faster than tradition could handle. Then, in a voice softer than before, Judge Jones said, "You may be right, Ms. Crockett, but change, if too sudden, can break what it's meant to fix." That line hit the room like poetry. Even Jasmine paused, as if the words had reached her heart. She didn't respond. She simply nodded, acknowledging the wisdom behind the statement. For a moment, there was no battle, no clash of egos, no verbal fire. Just two strong women from different generations, sharing the same courtroom and realizing that respect and conviction can exist together. But as the judge turned her attention back to the case file, something unexpected happened. A statement from the gallery interrupted the silence. Someone whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe the judge just doesn't like strong women." The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet. Gasps filled the air. Judge Jones slowly looked up, her expression unreadable. Jasmine's eyes widened, not in fear, but in concern. The storm had just begun. The whisper that shook the court. For a split second, no one moved. The words, "Maybe the judge just doesn't like strong women," still echoed across the courtroom like thunder after lightning. Everyone's eyes darted toward the back row where the voice had come from. Judge Edith Jones slowly lifted her gaze. The silence was sharp enough to cut through glass. Reporters froze mid-scribble, unsure whether to record or stay still. The air was heavy, not with anger, but with disbelief. Jasmine Crockett turned slightly, her expression a mix of shock and concern. She knew that kind of comment could twist the situation dangerously. The last thing she wanted was to turn a respectful disagreement into a public scandal. Judge Jones finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Whoever made that remark, stand up." A man hesitated, then slowly rose from the last bench. He looked nervous, maybe realizing too late what his words had unleashed. "Your Honor, I didn't mean—" Judge Jones raised a hand. "This courtroom is not a place for assumptions or accusations. Justice isn't about gender, race, or strength. It's about truth. And that truth," she said, pausing for effect, "starts with discipline." The entire room went quiet again. Even the man bowed his head and mumbled an apology. Then, to everyone's surprise, Jasmine spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may, he was wrong to say that. But maybe it's a reminder that people outside this courtroom don't always see justice as fair. They see emotions. They see moments. And sometimes they misunderstand both of us." Her voice was steady, full of honesty, not rebellion. Judge Jones studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's a fair point, Ms. Crockett. Perception can be powerful, sometimes more than truth itself." For the first time, there was no tension, only understanding. Two women, standing on opposite sides of the bench, but united by something deeper, the desire to be heard and respected. The judge took off her glasses and sighed. "I appreciate your restraint today, Ms. Crockett. The world needs more passion like yours and guided by wisdom." That line struck every listener in the room. Cameras clicked again, capturing a rare moment of mutual respect between power and principle. But deep down, both women knew this conversation wasn't over. Something unspoken lingered between them. A question about justice, gender, and integrity that neither the gavel nor the law could fully answer. And as the court adjourned for recess, whispers filled the hall again, not of scandal but of admiration. Everyone had witnessed not just a legal hearing but a turning point in perspective. Whispers beyond the bench. As the judge struck the gavel announcing a short recess, the courtroom exploded into motion. Reporters rushed toward the hallway, cameras flashing like lightning. Every outlet wanted one headline: "Judge Jones confronts Jasmine Crockett in fiery exchange." But behind those sensational words, the truth was far more complex. Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the courtroom and walked toward a quiet corner. Her assistant hurried behind her, whispering updates about social media reactions. People were already taking sides. Some praised her courage, others accused her of disrespecting authority. Jasmine sighed deeply. "It's never about what you say," she murmured. "It's always about how loud people want to hear it." She looked tired, not from the case, but from being misunderstood. Despite her confidence, she was human too, vulnerable, and aware of how every word could be turned into a weapon online. Meanwhile, inside the judge's chambers, Judge Edith Jones sat alone, staring at her reflection in the polished wood of her desk. The remark from the audience still echoed in her mind. Maybe the judge just doesn't like strong women? It wasn't true, but it hurt. Because for years, she had fought to be respected in a system that once doubted women in power. She had earned every ounce of her authority, every line of wisdom on her face. For the first time that day, Judge Jones felt something unusual. Doubt. Was she too hard on Jasmine? Or was she simply holding her to the same standard she held for herself decades ago? Her clerk knocked gently on the door. "Your Honor, are you all right?" Judge Jones nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, just thinking about how the world sees us." The clerk hesitated. "Honestly, ma'am, I think they saw something powerful in that courtroom today. Two women, not fighting, but standing." That line lingered in the judge's mind. Maybe this wasn't a confrontation. Maybe it was a conversation generations needed to witness. Outside, the cameras found Jasmine again. A reporter called out, "Congresswoman Crockett, how do you feel about the judge's comments?" She stopped, looked straight into the camera, and said calmly, "Judge Jones wasn't my opponent. She was my mirror. We both care about justice. We just walk different roads to get there." The clip went viral within minutes. People didn't see anger. They saw grace. They saw a powerful woman choosing respect over retaliation. Back inside, when Judge Jones heard about Jasmine's words, she quietly smiled for the first time that day. The courtroom wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It had become a bridge between two strong voices. But little did either of them know. The next day, something would happen that would test that fragile respect once again, in front of the entire nation. The final verdict that stunned everyone. The next morning, the courtroom was packed, tighter than ever before. Reporters filled every corner, microphones ready, cameras focused. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next between Judge Edith Jones and Jasmine Crockett. When Judge Jones entered, the entire room stood. Her expression was calm, unreadable. Jasmine, seated at the front, nodded respectfully. The tension wasn't born of anger anymore. It was anticipation. Judge Jones adjusted her papers, took a deep breath, and began speaking. "Before we proceed with today's matter, I wish to address what occurred yesterday." The murmurs stopped instantly. Our courtroom witnessed passion from both sides. But passion, when paired with respect, can be one of the strongest forces for justice. Ms. Crockett reminded us that the voice of truth doesn't always sound polite, but it must always be heard. Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. The words were not a reprimand, they were acknowledgement. Judge Jones continued, "And I realized something important. Strength doesn't threaten justice. It strengthens it. What matters is not attitude, but intent." Gasps rippled across the room. The same judge who had once called out Jasmine's attitude was now publicly praising her conviction. Then, in a gesture no one expected, Judge Jones looked directly at Jasmine and said, "Ms. Crockett, I may not always agree with your methods, but I respect your courage. You remind this court, and perhaps even me, that justice must keep growing, just as society does." The room fell silent. Jasmine slowly stood, her voice calm yet emotional. "Your Honor, that means more than any verdict could. Thank you, not just for hearing me, but for listening." A faint smile crossed the judge's face. "Court will now resume." But the moment wasn't over. Reporters were already typing, recording, and whispering. They knew this wasn't just a court case anymore. It was a lesson in respect, change, and humility. As the gavel struck one last time, applause quietly rose from the gallery, hesitant at first, then stronger. For the first time in years, a courtroom known for silence erupted in something beautiful: unity. Later that evening, as the news replayed the footage nationwide, one headline stood out everywhere. "Judge Edith Jones praises Jasmine Crockett, a historic moment of mutual respect." Jasmine watched the broadcast alone in her office, a soft smile on her face. Across town, Judge Jones did the same, quietly sipping her tea. Neither of them spoke, but both knew something had changed. Not just between them, but in the way people saw strength and respect in the same frame. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about two powerful women showing the world that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect, and that sometimes the most shocking reaction is kindness. After the gavel fell, when the courtroom finally emptied, the echo of applause still floated through the marble halls. Reporters had already vanished outside to broadcast their breaking news. But inside those stone walls, the air felt lighter, almost peaceful. Jasmine Crockett lingered near the doorway, quietly watching Judge Jones gather her notes. For a woman known for her sharp tone, the judge's movements now seemed almost gentle, as if the weight of years had just been lifted. "Your Honor," Jasmine called softly. Judge Jones looked up, surprised to see her still there. "You stayed behind? I wanted to thank you, not for agreeing with me, but for hearing me out." The judge smiled faintly. "Ms. Crockett, the world will remember what happened in here today, but what I'll remember is that you made me think. That doesn't happen often." Both women laughed lightly, a small, genuine laugh that carried more warmth than any verdict. Through the tall courtroom windows, sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the benches. It felt symbolic, a quiet sign that something had shifted, not only between two people, but within a whole generation of voices. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras. Jasmine knew what waited for her: microphones, opinions, and the endless noise of public debate. Yet she walked out calm, shoulders straight, a subtle smile on her face. A reporter shouted, "Congresswoman, do you think today changed anything?" She stopped, looked straight into the lens, and replied, "Change doesn't start with laws, and it starts with listening. Today, a judge listened. Tomorrow, maybe the world will too." Those words went viral within hours. Commentators called it the day respect went both ways. Social media, for once, wasn't divided. People admired the grace on both sides. Meanwhile, in her chambers, Judge Jones sat alone, sipping tea as the evening light faded. She replayed the moment in her mind. Jasmine's words, her courage, the calm that followed. Maybe strength and patience were never enemies, she whispered to herself. For the first time in years, she felt hopeful that justice could evolve without losing its dignity. Two women, two paths, one understanding. And beyond the marble walls of that courtroom, a quiet ripple of respect began spreading, far wider than either of them could ever imagine. When the world took sides, by the next morning, the story had already taken over every major news channel. Headlines flashed across screens in bold letters. Judge Jones and Jasmine Crockett face off in courtroom showdown. Some called it a clash of power, others a lesson in grace. Clips from the hearing flooded the internet. Judge Jones's calm expression, Jasmine's passionate response, the quiet applause at the end. Millions watched it on repeat, debating every word, every glance. But what surprised everyone most was how divided, yet inspired, people felt. On one side, viewers admired Judge Jones for her discipline and old-school dignity. They saw her as a symbol of order and respect. On the other, thousands praised Jasmine Crockett for her courage to speak truth in a place where most people stay silent. And in the middle of it all, there were those who didn't pick sides. They just saw something rare. Two powerful women disagreeing with respect instead of hostility. Social media exploded with reactions. Tweets poured in. Finally, a debate without hate. Judge Jones is the example of calm authority. Jasmine Crockett showed what modern leadership looks like. Even late-night hosts and talk shows couldn't resist. But instead of mockery, the tone was different this time. Admiration. People were tired of arguments turning ugly. This story was different. It gave them hope. Meanwhile, both women stayed silent. Jasmine turned down interviews, focusing instead on her work. She didn't want fame from the moment. She wanted meaning. Judge Jones, too, refused all media requests. When asked for comment, she simply said, "The courtroom isn't a stage, it's where we learn to listen." But the more they tried to stay quiet, the louder the public spoke. Memes turned into quotes. Quotes turned into discussions. Teachers began showing clips from the hearing in ethics and leadership classes. One commentator said on live TV, it wasn't about right or wrong, it was about how they handled it. Respect met courage, and both won. That line went viral. By the end of the week, something remarkable happened. A petition started circulating online, calling the moment between Judge Jones and Jasmine Crockett a symbol of respectful discourse. Thousands signed it, not for politics or publicity, but for hope that maybe, just maybe, people could disagree and still respect each other again. And while the internet buzzed with debates and admiration, neither woman knew what was coming next. An unexpected meeting that would bring them face to face again. This time, not in court, but in front of the nation. The reunion that captivated the nation. A week later, an unexpected announcement hit the news. Judge Edith Jones and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett were both invited to speak at a national Women in Leadership conference in Washington, D.C. At first, no one believed they would both attend. The viral courtroom moment was still dominating headlines. Clips had reached millions worldwide. Would they meet again, face to face, in front of an audience this time? The answer came soon enough. On the day of the conference, the auditorium was packed. Politicians, students, journalists, everyone wanted to see what would happen when two of the most talked about women in America stood on the same stage. The host introduced them with careful words. Two women, two generations, one conversation that changed how we see respect. Jasmine Crockett walked on stage first, dressed in calm confidence. She smiled politely, her usual fiery energy softened by grace. Moments later, Judge Jones appeared from the opposite side, dignified as always, her silver hair gleaming under the lights, her posture straight as ever. For a moment, the crowd went completely silent. The two women stood just a few feet apart, looking at each other. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Then, to everyone's surprise, Jasmine stepped forward first. She extended her hand. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I'm glad we meet again. This time without the gavel." The judge chuckled lightly, shaking her hand. "And without objections," she replied. The audience burst into warm laughter and applause. The tension that once filled a courtroom now melted into mutual admiration. When it was time to speak, Jasmine took the microphone and said, "That courtroom moment wasn't planned. It wasn't about winning. It was about being heard and learning that respect doesn't silence you. It sharpens you." The crowd applauded again. Then Judge Jones took her turn, her tone steady but filled with sincerity. "I spent my life teaching others that the law demands order, but that day I learned something from Ms. Crockett, that order means nothing if it cannot grow with courage." Those words earned a standing ovation. For once, authority and activism stood side by side, not as rivals, but as equals. After the session ended, the two women shared a quiet moment backstage. Jasmine smiled and said, "Funny how one courtroom day can turn into something bigger than both of us." Judge Jones nodded. "Because sometimes real justice doesn't happen in court, it happens in hearts." That quote became the headline everywhere the next morning. Across social media, across newspapers, across TV screens, people weren't just watching a story anymore. They were feeling it. The ripple that changed everything. The days following the conference felt different, not just in Washington, but across the entire nation. Clips of Judge Edith Jones and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett shaking hands flooded every platform. News anchors called it the moment America needed. Something unusual had happened. For once, people weren't arguing online. They were agreeing. Students quoted the judge's line, "Order means nothing if it cannot grow with courage." Activists praised Jasmine's statement, "Respect doesn't silence you, it sharpens you." Even rival political groups reposted the video, adding captions like, "This is how disagreement should look." It was as if the entire country had paused to take a collective breath, realizing that strength and grace could coexist. Meanwhile, both women returned to their normal routines. But nothing felt entirely normal anymore. In her congressional office, Jasmine sat by her window, scrolling through messages from young women across the country. One said, "I used to think confidence made people hate me. Now I know. It's how you use it that matters." She smiled, eyes soft. That was why she had entered public service. Not for fame, but to inspire belief. Across town, Judge Jones received a handwritten letter from a young law student. It read, "I want to be like you, firm but fair, brave but kind. Thank you for showing us that justice has a heart." For a woman who had spent decades behind a bench, that note meant more than any award ever could. When the two women finally spoke on the phone days later, the conversation was short but full of warmth. "Ms. Crockett," the judge said, "I think we've started something neither of us planned." "Maybe that's how real change always starts, Your Honor," Jasmine replied, "not by design, but by courage." They laughed softly, sharing the comfort of mutual respect that no controversy could shake. By the end of that month, several universities invited both of them to co-host a panel on civil discourse, a topic once considered too boring for prime time, now suddenly viral. What began as a tense courtroom exchange had become a movement, one reminding people that listening is not weakness and patience is not surrender. And though both women went back to their separate worlds, one thing bound them together forever: the moment they turned a courtroom clash into a national conversation on human dignity. The ripples of that single gavel strike had reached farther than any verdict ever could. The legacy of a single moment. Months passed, seasons changed, but the moment between Judge Edith Jones and Jasmine Crockett never truly faded. It lived on, replayed in classrooms, shared in motivational talks, and quoted in leadership workshops. What began as a courtroom confrontation had quietly become a symbol of hope. One evening, Judge Jones was invited to speak at a law school graduation. She stood before hundreds of young faces, all eager to begin their journeys in justice. But instead of giving her usual speech about discipline and order, she chose to tell a story. "A few months ago," she began, "I met a woman in my courtroom who challenged me, not with disrespect, but with courage. She reminded me that justice must evolve with those it serves." The audience listened in silence. We live in a world where shouting is easy and listening is rare. But that day I learned that listening, truly listening, can change everything. When she finished, the crowd rose in a standing ovation. For once, her words weren't about law, they were about understanding. That same evening, across the city, Jasmine Crockett was at a community event for young leaders. She too was asked about that viral day. She smiled and said, "People thought it was a fight, but it wasn't. It was a reminder that disagreement doesn't make you enemies, it makes you human. And if you face criticism with grace, even your critics might become your allies." Her audience clapped, not just out of respect, but because they felt it. They had seen enough arguments in the world. Now, they wanted more moments like this one. Later that night, both women, miles apart, looked out their respective windows. The city lights flickered below, and in their own quiet ways, they both smiled. Neither of them knew the other was doing the same. But they shared the same thought: that maybe the world had learned something that day. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about politics. It was about listening beyond ego, about respecting beyond titles, and about finding unity in differences. And in that silent understanding, something beautiful was born. Not just a moment in history, but a message for the future. "Justice grows stronger," Judge Jones had once said, "when courage and respect walk hand in hand." That quote would later be engraved outside the courthouse where it all began. A permanent reminder that sometimes the most shocking reaction is simply kindness. The end.